Darkness is here. Welcome to the nightfall. Some encounters defy explanation, disturbing, impossible, and unforgettable. These are true stories of people who came face to face with something they couldn't explain and wish they never had. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, Jake, Lisa, and Brandon. We'd been hiking all day, making our way through the dense forest until we reached a clearing near a small lake. The place was perfect, quiet, isolated. We set up our tents, started a fire, and cracked open some beers. It was one of those nights where everything felt just right. The crackling of the fire, the cool night air, the occasional hoot of an owl, it all felt peaceful. Until it didn't. It started with Brandon. He was collecting firewood when he stopped mid-step, his flashlight aimed at something just beyond the trees. "Hey, did you guys see that?" Lisa laughed. "See what?" Brandon hesitated. "I don't know. Thought I saw someone standing in the trees." Jake scoffed. "Probably a deer, dude. Relax." Brandon shook his head, but didn't argue. We let it go. An hour passed, and we were deep in conversation when Lisa suddenly went stiff. Her face paled as she pointed past the fire. "There. Over there." We turned, our flashlights sweeping the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees, shadows, and more trees. Then I saw it, just for a second. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, completely still. It was too far to make out details, but I could tell it was tall. Unnaturally tall. "Hello," Jake called out. No answer. The figure didn't move. Didn't even twitch. "Maybe it's a hunter," I suggested, though my stomach twisted at the thought. Hunters usually announce themselves. They didn't just stand there. Brandon picked up a large stick and waved it in the air. "Hey, who's out there?" Still no response. Then, just as Lisa's flashlight landed on it, the figure stepped backward into the trees and disappeared. A cold silence settled over us. "Okay," Jake said, standing up. "I don't like this." None of us did. But we were about to pack up and leave in the middle of the night, so we agreed to sleep in shifts. I took the first watch. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the fire was nearly out. A thick, suffocating darkness had settled over the campsite. And then I heard it, a low, rhythmic clicking sound, like someone tapping two stones together. Click, click, click. It was coming from the trees. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the sound. The figure was back. Only now it was closer, just beyond the dying firelight. Its face was barely visible. But something was wrong. It wasn't a face. It was smooth, featureless, like skin stretched over a blank skull. Click, click, click. The sound wasn't stones. It was its fingers, tapping together. I scrambled backward, kicking over the firewood pile. The noise woke Brandon, who shot up with a start. "Dude, what the? Run!" I shouted. Brandon looked where my flashlight was aimed and turned white. He didn't need to be told twice. We tore into Lisa and Jake's tent, screaming for them to wake up. They didn't ask questions. They just ran with us. The four of us sprinted through the forest, branches whipping against our skin, our breath ragged. I didn't dare look back. The clicking sound followed us. Faster, louder. Then, suddenly it stopped. We reached the car and piled in, slamming the doors shut. Jake fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and he floored it. Only then did I dare to look back. The trees stood still, silent. The figure was gone. We never went back to that spot. And to this day, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. Click, click, click. It was a little after midnight when I left my friend's apartment. We'd been hanging out, playing video games, and I lost track of time. My apartment was only a few blocks away, so I figured I'd walk. It was quiet. The streets were empty, and the only sound was my footsteps on the pavement. I liked the stillness of the city at night, until that night. I first noticed her at the corner of my eye. A woman standing under a flickering street lamp across the street. She was facing me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just a woman waiting for a bus or an Uber. But then I noticed something strange. She was smiling. Not just a normal smile, a wide, stretched grin that seemed unnatural. I quickened my pace, glancing at her briefly. She didn't move, didn't blink, just kept grinning. I turned down the next street, feeling uneasy. That's when I heard footsteps, soft, slow, keeping pace with mine. I glanced back. She was there, still smiling. But now, she was on my side of the street. She hadn't been walking. She hadn't crossed. But somehow, she was closer. A chill ran down my spine. I forced myself to keep walking, pretending not to notice. My heart pounded. I wasn't far from home. The footsteps behind me stopped. For a second, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Then I heard it, a whisper. "Why aren't you smiling?" I spun around. She was right there, too close. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, her mouth stretched into that same horrible grin. Her teeth were too white, too sharp. I stumbled back. "What the hell do you want?" She tilted her head, the grin never faltering. "You'd look so much better if you smiled," she whispered. I turned and ran. I could hear her laughing, low and breathy, like she was enjoying this. I reached my apartment building, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped them. I forced the key into the lock and shoved the door open, slamming it behind me. I ran up the stairs to my apartment, locked the door, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. For a long time, I just sat there listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No laughter. Eventually, I convinced myself it was over. I got up, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat on my couch trying to calm down. Then my phone buzzed. A notification from an unknown number. One image. A photo of my apartment door. And beneath it, a message. "You'd look so much better if you smiled." I moved out 2 weeks later. When we first moved into the house, the neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet, safe. The kind of place where neighbors smiled at each other and kids rode their bikes until sunset. Except for him. The house next door had a single occupant, a man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. He never spoke to anyone, never left his house. The curtains were always drawn, and the mailbox was always empty. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people just prefer to be left alone. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing things. His porch light would turn on and off at random hours. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of movement behind the curtains, just a shadow, shifting in the dim glow of a lamp. And then there was the feeling, that heavy, oppressive feeling of being watched. One evening, I was taking out the trash when I saw him. He was standing at his window, staring at me. No expression, no movement, just watching. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, something about them was wrong. They didn't look real. I quickly looked away and hurried back inside. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside my window. Tap, 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 soft, rhythmic, like fingers against the glass. I sat up, my heart hammering. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The window was empty. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination. But the next morning, I found footprints in the dew-covered grass. Bare footprints, leading from my window, back to his house. I told my dad. He shrugged it off, saying I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a stray dog, he suggested. Maybe even kids playing a prank. But I knew. A few days later, we saw the coroner's van outside his house. They were carrying out a body. The body of the man who lived there. Apparently, he'd been dead for weeks. But that was impossible, because I had just seen him. I've been driving for a rideshare company for a while, mostly picking up people late at night. It's not the safest job, but the money's decent, and I like the quiet roads. That night, I was working the graveyard shift, cruising through empty streets, waiting for a ride request. At around 2:30 a.m., I got a ping from a location just outside the city, a rural road near an old cemetery. That should have been my first red flag. Nobody's out there at this hour. But I was tired and wasn't thinking straight, so I accepted the request and drove out. The road was barely lit, flanked by tall trees that looked like they swallowed whatever little moonlight was left. I pulled up to the pin location, scanning the area. There was no one there. I sighed and was about to cancel when I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A woman. She stood at the edge of the road, wearing a long, dark dress. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her hair fell in tangled strands over her shoulders. I hadn't seen her walk up. She was just there. I hesitated, but then she raised her hand in a slow wave, signaling for me. I rolled down the window. "Are you the one who called for a ride?" She nodded. Something about her gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't want to be rude. Maybe she had car trouble or needed to get back into town. Sure. Hop in." She slid into the back seat without a word. My skin crawled. Something about the air in the car felt wrong, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the moment she shut the door. I checked the app. The destination was deep in the city, about a 20-minute drive. I started driving, sneaking glances at her in the mirror. She was staring straight ahead, not at her phone, not at the road, just sitting there, perfectly still. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her nails looked dirty, cracked. Trying to break the silence, I asked, "So, you live in the city?" "Nothing." I cleared my throat. "Late night, huh?" Still no response. I glanced in the mirror again. She was smiling, but not a normal smile. It was small, subtle, wrong, like she was enjoying some private joke I wasn't in on. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Miss?" "Nothing." A cold sweat broke out on my back. I focused on the road, deciding to just get to the destination as fast as possible. Then I noticed something in the mirror. Her reflection. It was wrong. She was sitting still in the back seat, but in the mirror, she was facing me, smiling wider. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. My breath came in sharp gasps. My hands trembled on the wheel. I turned around, ready to tell her to get the hell out of my car. The back seat was empty. I stared, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door was still shut. The seatbelt was still buckled. She was gone. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call someone, anyone. That's when I saw the rideshare app. The ride was still active, but the pickup location had changed. I wasn't at the cemetery anymore. The app now showed my starting point as an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The drop-off location? My house. My entire body went cold. I ended the ride and sped home, barely able to keep my hands steady. I locked my doors, shut my windows, and sat in my car until the sun came up. I never drove for that company again, and I still wonder, if I had kept driving, where would she have taken me? It started like any other business trip. I travel a lot for work, so I'm used to the routine: flight delays, overpriced airport food, and checking into generic hotels that all look the same. This one was no different. It was a tall, slightly outdated building downtown. Not fancy, but clean. The kind of place businessmen and out-of-town tourists stayed for a night or two before moving on. I arrived late, almost midnight, after a long, exhausting day. The lobby was nearly empty, save for the man at the front desk, an older gentleman with graying hair and tired eyes. "Reservation for Michael Carter," I said, sliding my ID across the counter. He nodded, typing into his computer. His fingers moved fast, but something about the way he hesitated made me uneasy. Yes, Mr. Carter," he said, forcing a polite smile. "You're in room 303. He handed me the key card. His fingers trembled slightly. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just tired. I took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. Room 303 was at the very end of the hall. I slid in my key card, the lock clicked open, and I stepped inside. It looked normal, a little outdated like the rest of the hotel. A queen-size bed, a desk with an old lamp, a TV mounted on the wall. Beige wallpaper, thin, gray carpet. I tossed my suitcase onto the bed, kicked off my shoes, and checked my phone. No new messages. I was about to take a shower when something caught my eye. The closet door. It was slightly open, just an inch. Now, I knew for a fact that hotel staff always leave the closet doors closed after cleaning. It was standard. I frowned and walked over, pulling it open all the way. Empty. Just a few wooden hangers, a spare pillow on the top shelf. I let out a breath and shook my head. Tired. I'm just tired. I shut the closet, double-checked the lock on the door, and headed to the bathroom. As I stepped into the shower, I heard it, a soft creak, like a door slowly opening. I froze. The sound came from the room. I turned off the water, heart pounding, and listened. Silence. I pulled on a towel and stepped out. The room was exactly as I left it, except the closet door was open again. Just an inch. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stared at it, every nerve in my body screaming something isn't right. Slowly, I walked over and pulled it open again. Still empty. I reached inside and ran my hand along the back wall, half expecting to feel some hidden passage or loose panel. Nothing. I shook my head, shut the door, and muttered to myself, "You're just overthinking this." I climbed into bed, turned off the lights, and closed my eyes. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound. Creak. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, but the hallway light outside cast a faint glow through the gap under the door. I turned my head slowly. The closet door was wide open. My breath hitched. The room felt off, like I wasn't alone. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The closet was empty, but now there were footprints in the carpet. Not mine, bare footprints leading from the closet to the side of my bed. A wave of ice washed over me. I jumped up, grabbed my bag, and rushed out of the room, heart racing. I didn't stop until I reached the front desk. The clerk looked up, startled. I need a different room," I stammered. His face paled. He didn't even ask why, just grabbed a key card and handed it to me. "Room 407. I nodded, too shaken to question it. As I turned to leave, I hesitated. "Has this happened before?" The clerk swallowed hard. "Room 303 has been out of service for years. I don't know how you got a key for it." I stared at him. "What do you mean? You gave it to me?" He shook his head. "No, sir. You were booked in 407. That's the key I handed you." I felt sick. I opened my palm, looking at the key card I had used. It was blank. No room number. No markings. Just a plain plastic card. I left the hotel at dawn, without ever stepping foot back in that room. A week later, I tried to look up the hotel online. It didn't exist. The building was real, but according to every record I could find, it had been abandoned for years. There were no employees, no reservations, no room 303. If you made it this far, you're one of us now. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. And if you have a terrifying story of your own, we want to hear it. Send your encounters to the email in our bio, because the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. Until next time, stay in the light.